This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
3 minutes after 10 is the time. A very good morning indeed to you. This will not be a normal programme for one enormous reason. At 11 o'clock today, Sir Martin Moore-Bick will deliver his conclusions after his inquiry into the Grenfell Tower tragedy. We will be taking that live, and we will be working our way through some of the details subsequent to his statement, which will come at approximately 11 o'clock. We will also be speaking to some people profoundly affected by the events of June the 14th, 2017. Events that, as you know, left 72 people dead. And it also means that we can't get into the detail until 11 o'clock. So, albeit that this is by far the most important thing happening today, we will talk about something else shortly until about 10 to 11, when I will remind you of some of the coverage of this unprecedented and still, to me, almost incomprehensible tragedy that we did on this programme. I think we could say some of the friends that we made and some of the promises that we made. Promises that I think Sir Martin Moore-Bick is set to deliver on today. My feeling, having been quite close to the story and some of the people involved, is that there is a cautious optimism abroad about what is likely to be in the 1,700 pages of report that is embargoed until 11 o'clock. Although, of course, some people will have had the opportunity to see its contents already. A few words, if I may, on what that morning was like here. That there will never be, please God, another morning like it. And that there are two elements of the tragedy that I think you will either remember or perhaps be interested in hearing about if you weren't with us at the time. It unfolded while we slept, the tragedy, for the rest of the world, for the people who didn't live in that corner of North Kensington. A kitchen in a block of flats, flat 16, I think, had a dodgy fridge freezer, which started a blaze, which spread as a consequence, as we will learn later today, of cladding in which the building had been covered. Some people have suggested in order to make the view a little more pleasant from some expensive properties that were growing up in the area. But as we made our way to work, so I was back in the day, I was getting picked up in a car. It was before Greta Thunberg's influence upon my children prompted them to ban me from getting driven to work, and popped me onto public transport. I'd get driven to work, and I remember just sort of reeling from the unfolding reality of what was going on, and the sense that, people were trapped in a burning building. It's like something out of a sort of Hollywood tragedy. People were trapped in a burning building and people were able to speak to them. I don't know if you remember Shah, who spoke to us on several occasions on the programme, but he was talking to his mother and their aunt. And as the tragedy unfolded, and I'll never forget him or his story, because the journey from thinking that things were going to be okay and that they'd be rescued, because the advice of the fire brigade, the advice of the fire service, was contingent upon the building's condition when it was built, in which case the advice is to stay put, because the concrete nature of the building will ensure that a blaze can't spread from flat 16 to every other flat in the block. And of course, by the time 6 o'clock came round, by which point all 999 calls from Grenfell Tower had stopped, the grim and grisly truth had settled, and people like Shah had practically been on the phone to their family while that reality dawned until the very end. And the second element of it, so the first is the scale, the horror of the tragedy, the absolute horror of it. The second is the fact that people knew it was going to happen. We've spoken a few times on the programme to Edward Defan. It was Edward and his friend and neighbour Francis O'Connor, who'd been working on a blog under the Grenfell Action Group title, and this was the bit that this almost broke me, to be honest, because we were talking yesterday about pride in your country. I couldn't believe that this could happen in our country. And I don't know whether that makes me naive or privileged or insulated from reality. But the blog that Edward and Francis wrote detailed, at some points in almost forensic level, it detailed what was likely to happen if their warnings went unheeded. He had written again and again and again about the likelihood of a serious fire. I still don't know how widely understood this fact is. 6 months before the 14th of June, they wrote, "It is our conviction that a serious fire in a tower block is the most likely reason that those who wield power at the Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation will be found out and brought to justice." 6 months before the tragedy happened, before it unfolded, Edward sat in his 16th floor flat in Grenfell Tower and wrote about the likelihood, or indeed his conviction, his certainty, that the only way in which some of the people he held responsible for the state of his home would be properly held to account for their flirtation with potential tragedy would be the tragedy actually occurring. And that was the bit which, I don't use this phrase very often, but as a journalist, that was the bit I couldn't get my head around. That was the bit that made me feel deep shame, I suppose. So our office used to be literally around the corner. Our studios used to be literally a stone's throw from Grenfell Tower. I used to live about a mile away. A slightly downhill journey. I could get on my bicycle and just roll down the hill to the old studios. I barely had to pedal. That's how close we were, at my home and my workplace. And I'd known nothing about the Grenfell Action Group. None of us had. I don't know that there was a, quotes, mainstream journalist, end quotes, in the book that could possibly have been fully au fait with it. And the frustration, the guilt that you feel towards people like Edward and Francis for not having somehow noticed a tragedy, a potential tragedy that was poised to unfold under our very noses. And that's why today is so important. The fate of 72 people. One of the strangest things about the story, a few of you, I think rightly, reminding me of Jacob Rees-Mogg's attempt to claim that the victims lacked common sense and that was somehow the reason why they died. I think even he felt that he had to apologise for that appalling contribution to public discourse. But it plays into what I wanted to say next about the bigger picture here, which was oddly a harbinger in many ways of what was to come, because class and race played a part in this story. The fact that the Prime Minister didn't turn up until it was arguably a little late. The late Queen, of course, did make a journey to the site of the tragedy, but the speed with which the ethnicity or the immigration status of many of the people in the flat was sort of smuggled into the conversation was hideous to see. And of course the class. If that block had been full of wealthy white people, or just wealthy people, Grenfell Tower would have been on the lips of everybody in this country for the next 7 years. And of course, while Martin Moore-Bick has been going about his work in, I am told, an incredibly exhaustive and impressive fashion, the spotlight of public attention has moved on, of course. So that is why today's report, today's conclusion of this inquiry is so important. I know what is expected to be in it. I know a little bit about what is definitely in it. And I know what the survivors of the tragedy and the loved ones of many of the dead want to be in it. And the long and the short of it is that they want people to be punished. They want people to be identified, held responsible, and held to account. They want people to be arrested and they want people to be charged. That, I'm told, is unlikely to happen. In the immediate future, the police's hand has been stayed, of course, until the inquiry report is published. But these are the sort of details, these are the sort of issues that we will be looking into much further and much more deeply after Sir Martin Moore-Bick has delivered his conclusions today. But that element of the story, that was for me the one that is still the hardest to swallow. The fact that people were begging for attention and help because they were supremely confident of what was likely to happen in their homes, and nobody heeded their warnings until it was too late. So it's an incredible task that Sir Martin Moore-Bick has been set. There were early fears about his appointment. There were early fears about the nature of the inquiry, but at risk of jumping the gun or jinxing anything, the feeling I identify among the people most involved is one of cautious optimism about what we are likely to hear later today. And that comes from the perspective of people pursuing justice. I'll play you, before 11 o'clock, as I mentioned a moment ago, some of the coverage that we provided at the time. And there was one bit that I thought twice about including, but I think you'll understand why we have. And it involves one man's fears of a cover-up and the understandable terror that it would all go a little bit Hillsborough or infected blood scandal, and take decades of tireless campaigning to actually let the light in. I think and I pray that today we will derive confidence that Grenfell Tower will not be written alongside the infected blood scandal or the Hillsborough tragedy, or Orgreave or other infamous examples of institutional malfeasance and cover-up. I think today we will be given proof that Grenfell Tower is not going to end up in that category. It's 10:15. 17 minutes after 10 is the time. Well, I don't know about you, but I don't feel, having just sort of refreshed our memories of that dreadful night and what followed, I don't feel that I can actually now introduce a conversation about something completely different until 11:15. So I apologise. I'm kind of what passes for a running order on this programme is always pretty nebulous, but today there isn't one. So I'm going to open up my phone lines, I think, and just ask you, before Sir Martin Moore-Bick begins sharing his conclusions. Of course, Vinny adds the post office scandal to the list of institutional cover-ups that took far unconscionably long to be clarified. I knew there was one, Vinny. In the back of my mind, I was thinking, I know there's another one, but I do believe that today Grenfell families will be spared that fate. They will be spared that length of campaign in order to secure clarity and later justice. So what would you like to say to me? How do we do this? How did the Grenfell Tower tragedy change you? 0345 6060 973. How did it change you? Because I hesitate to go there, to be honest with you, because it pollutes something that's much more important than the issue I'm about to refer to. But it taught me about two-tier justice. It taught me about what your social status does in the face of your country's concern for you. And I know you may think it's a bit ridiculous to have got into your mid-40s without having properly clocked that, but the story afterwards about where people could go was absolutely extraordinary. We were taking calls from people 24, 48 hours after the tragedy had occurred who didn't know what to do and they didn't know where to go. If it wasn't for the local mosque and the local church, they would have had no institutional or societal support. The engines of care were completely absent. And I knew, even though I only lived a couple of miles up the road, that if that had happened on my estate, that simply would not have happened. The engines of care, the engines of authority would have kicked in, would have turned up. Could you imagine if 72 people had burnt to death in other parts of the country or other parts of town? Could you imagine 48 hours later, the surviving families whose every belonging had been immolated, everything they owned, if they were lucky enough to get out, had been burnt to cinders, and 24 to 48 hours later, they were still not being looked after. There was still nowhere to care. They still didn't know, apart from the charity of friends or local religious organisations, they still didn't know where they were going to spend the night or what they were going to wear or eat. I can see why I've closed down some compartments in my memory, because it was unconscionable. You know, I sometimes say to you, looking in the mirror, the dislike of what you sometimes see in the mirror sees you blame the person who holds it up. So it's one of my favourite theories. But I felt that the Grenfell Tower tragedy held a mirror up to our country, to our society, and to inequalities and injustices that, you know, even those of us who like to think we're fairly woke, to use a word that wasn't really in public discourse much at the time, or we like to think that we're fairly alive to injustice and inequality. I look back on that and I could not believe the country that I lived in. I truly couldn't. And here we are. So roll on, 11 o'clock, roll on, Sir Martin Moore-Bick. If you want to tell me anything about this, otherwise we can talk about the right to buy scheme. I told you this wasn't going to be a normal programme. What is, for you, what do the words Grenfell Tower conjure up in your mind, in your heart, and indeed in your memory? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. 7 years ago, the Daily Mail, to give credit where it's due, provides a timeline today over 2 pages, starting at 10 to 1 on the morning of June the 14th and ending with words on the aftermath and picking up on an almost minute-by-minute account of what unfolded that day and the slow and then quick dawning of just how much was at stake and just how appalling the spread of the fire would be. And it makes even now, well, especially now, 7 years later, absolutely harrowing reading. One paragraph here: on the 16th floor, resident Edward Daffan, 53, is staggering around the smoke-filled corridor trying to find the staircase. In a panic, he puts out both hands to find his way, and the wet towel round his face falls off. He collapses. I thought to myself, this isn't going to end well for me. Then he feels someone tap his leg, and the firefighter Jamal Stern, who has been crawling through the smoke on his stomach, picks him up and leads him to the stairway. Stern asks if he's okay. Edward says yes and reaches the stairs. Stern continues his search. And as Ben reminds us, it happened in what I think was the wealthiest borough in the country, certainly in the top 2 or 3. And yet, when the necessity of care and concern for these people was absolutely acute, it was all voluntary. It all fell to religious communities. It fell to religious organisations and volunteers and charities to provide the help in the very, very first instances. And it was Theresa May, you're right, I perhaps should have named her. It was Theresa May who managed to compound the horror by failing to show any leadership whatsoever. It's coming up to 24 minutes after 10. Sorry, I didn't realise I had quite so much to get off my chest about this. I thought we were going to wait until 11 o'clock, but as you can see, the imminent publication of the final report on the Grenfell disaster is going to bring an awful lot of thoughts and memories back to the forefront of all of our minds, which is why I'd ask you what it is that you think of first, what it is that you focus on first, an element of the tragedy, perhaps an element of the coverage, something from the aftermath or the precursors. You perhaps, like some of the people who lived in the tower, know what it's like to have your warnings go unheeded. I've mentioned Jacob Rees-Mogg. I don't think it would be a fitting memorial to the dead to focus upon some of the ghoulish contributions to public discourse that came in the aftermath from people who, frankly, should have known much, much better. But it's still there. The carcass of the building is still there. I'd like nothing I've ever lived through, reported on, or witnessed in my life in this country as a man aged 52. And I've been frankly, I'm not really minded to talk about anything else today. 25 minutes after 10 is the time. Beth reminds us, thank God for the incredible work done by the Duchess of Sussex, Meghan Markle, who visited the survivors, created the Together cookbook, raised more than £500,000 to sustain the Grenfell kitchen, which still caters to the food needs of the survivors today. Mark tells me that Grenfell started the safety aspects of my tower block home of 36 years to proceed to demolition. It's now gone, but age-related, and the failure to spend money on refurbishments. Austerity, James writes Lorraine. Grenfell was the absolute tragic visual symbol of 14 years of austerity cuts, although we'd only had 7 by then. And the poison of exploitation of those without power, non-accountability of those with power. It makes my heart ache and my blood boil. And on it goes. And yeah, Lord Pickles is one of the people who I suspect is, Eric Pickles as he was, is waiting the content, the detail of the report with a particular nervousness. James is in Sidcup. James, you are, as my very careful listeners will probably remember, you're a housing expert. What made you pick up the phone today?
Well, James, good morning to you.
Hello.
And it's a very, very sad day, and it's just amazed me how much time has elapsed since we spoke.
Well, this is when we first established contact, I think, was in the aftermath of the Grenfell Tower tragedy, when you rang me from the perspective of someone who'd been intimately involved in the housing sector for decades, and I think it's fair to say you were probably less shocked than many of the rest of us.
Sadly, yes, and I think the term I used was a slow-motion train wreck. That's where the point we'd arrived at. And it links very much into your reference to the right to buy. I think I did mention that at the time.
Go on.
That is a major element in this tragedy. I'll be very surprised if it doesn't emerge. But, of course, it's seen the dismantling of the lack of importance of social housing. And right to buy has literally dismantled communities and the economics around the provision of
because my rental investment is not going to be as precious to me as my home.
It's that with the idea of winning the pools on top of that, James. Okay. Who on earth is going to refuse half the value of their property, a discount? Who will do that? But unfortunately, as has been, I've heard today in the press, 40% of those homes are now private sector landlord properties, and the bill for those properties today have doubled the housing benefit bill. It's put another 20 billion on the housing benefit bill.
I wasn't expecting you to knit together the conversation I've decided not to have with the conversation that I've decided to have, but the relationship is intimate, isn't it? Absolutely inextricable.
It's utterly human. This cannot be separated from the behaviour of human beings, the reason for social housing, the reason that even Mr. Macmillan was building 350,000 council homes after the war, was basic humanity. And this dream, which has become a nightmare, that you could bribe enough people out of the homes provided by us, all of us, for us, and our children to come, and having lived through that process and seen social progress for those people that would have had no hope in the slums of Notting Hill in the 40s and the 50s.
Just round the corner.
Absolutely. But unfortunately, what we saw here is a monolith, a huge building, which itself was infested with the right to buy.
How closely did you follow the sort of public elements of the inquiry, the testimonies that were given by some of the people involved?
I kept a watching brief.
So, how optimistic are you that this is going to be very different from the Hillsborough or the Mid-Staffs or the Bloody Sunday or the Post Office Inquiry, the Kincora Boys Home, all the other sort of scandals in our lifetimes that have actually been covered up by the people that we naively entrust with looking after us or protecting us? I'm picking up cautious optimism from people who've been paying proper attention and from people personally connected to the events of that night.
I am always an optimist, James. Always. To have worked in this area and to work around housing, swimming against the stream, as it were, for so long, for the last 30 or 40 years, you've got to be an optimist. But sadly, I'm also aware of the environment and the sector, and the cover-up mentality and the look the other way mentality is so strong.
And that's why the pressure on Sir Martin Moore-Bick is so acute. The need for the depth and the breadth of his conclusions to reach parts that I don't know that any other inquiry of this nature has ever been required to reach before. James, thank you for calling in today, and thank you for all the help that you gave me when we started discussing this, with a stunned sort of sense of disbelief, which hasn't gone away. I can't believe it hasn't gone away. I didn't realise it hadn't gone away until I started talking this morning. 31 minutes after 10 is the time. Bob writes, what struck me, James, so much was the apparent absence of emergency planners. I couldn't understand why the response wasn't automatic, as emergency planners would have had a plan for everything. I think Lucy Easthope touches upon this in her rather splendid book, When the Dust Settles, and I was following her Twitter account last night, which it's fair to say was very nervous about what is likely to come out today, as in fearful, not on a personal level, but just in terms of what it may reveal about what should have been in place but wasn't. Another James writes, I worked as a volunteer at the Harrow Club across the road from Grenfell in the hours and days after the fire. We did some shows from there, James, actually. I'm traumatised by what I saw and the heartbreak I witnessed, but I'm also inspired by the work of my fellow volunteers of every race, religion and class who came together in those moments. In spite of the unaccountability of the establishment, we rose up and did what we could to support the community. It really was the best of Britain. Metaphorical heads should roll today, but much like Hillsborough, and I say this as a Liverpool fan, I think we'll be fighting for someone to take responsibility for decades. This country loves a cover-up. As James said, I guess that's the difference between optimism and pessimism. James in Sidcup, something of a self-styled optimist. James on my text message there, an understandable pessimist. And it is at 11 o'clock this morning that we will begin to find out whose expectations are going to be met and whose are going to be dashed. It's 33 minutes after 10. Thomas Watts is here now with the headlines. There's so many bits of elements of the story that you forget, and a few of you pointing out that we don't hear it as much as we used to, but you do still hear it. But do you remember that the Richard Littlejohn used to do it in the Daily Mail all the time, that the idea that health and safety were our enemies. I think he came up with a funny title for it, didn't he? He called it Elf and Safety. And yet, one of the things that we're almost certain to learn later today is that the deregulation ushered in by right-wing politicians would have played a huge part in the Grenfell Tower tragedy. How did we end up in a country where very prominent and very well-paid commentators and very senior politicians were able to persuade the population that health and safety laws and regulations were their enemy? I think, didn't high-vis vests used to be a figure of fun? Didn't people used to take the mickey out of high-vis vests? I don't know whether Grenfell changed that or whether people have just grown up a bit. But where does that come from? The idea that measures put in place to keep us safe and healthy are somehow negatives, are somehow bad for us. Extraordinary stories coming in, or extraordinary answers to the question of what Grenfell did to you. This is from Jack. It got me into politics, James. The most upsetting call I've ever heard on the radio was a young boy, on LBC, was a young boy stuck in the tower, being comforted by a family relation telling him not to worry and that Spider-Man would come along to save him, giving him some hope before he died. I cried, as did the presenter. I'm a councillor now, and I will do all that I can on my patch to stop anything like this ever happening again. Kevin suggests that Boris Johnson will be waiting in a fairly trepidatious nature, having imposed 6 years of budget cuts to the London Fire Brigade, closed 10 fire stations and made 550 firefighters redundant. Under Boris Johnson, the LFB lost 5 of its 7 hydraulic platforms, and all 7 attended Grenfell. An 8th was required. The nearest one available was at Guildford Fire Station. I remember learning some of that at the time. Kelly writes, my daughter was 10 at the time. She wanted to be a firefighter from the age of 5. She watched it all on TV. The next day, she took cakes to our local fire station to thank the firefighters. At 14, she became a nurse cadet, and now she's a fire cadet officer and will apply to join the service at 18 to become a full-time firefighter. Grenfell had a profound effect on her. That's from Kelly in Bexley Heath. We talked to quite a lot of firefighters at the time, didn't we? And my goodness me, their bravery is almost beyond description. Dave's in Shepherd's Bush. Dave, what would you like to say?
Hi, good morning, James.
Hello,
I'm not too sure, to be honest. I mean,
I know what you mean. I know what you mean.
It's a really strange one. Just a little bit of background. Born, raised, lived. We're of a similar age, you and I. North Kensington's where I've lived practically all my life. I live in Shepherd's Bush now, just round the corner. I mean, I'll tell you some of the stuff. You can guide the conversation if it's maybe just slightly better, because I'm not sure what sort of path to take. The night of the fire, a friend of mine who lives opposite phoned me to say that there was a fire in Grenfell. Could we phone? Because I've got some friends who lived in Grenfell, live in Grenfell. One who passed away, who lost his life in Grenfell. And my mate phoned me and said, look, there's a fire in Grenfell. Could you phone to see if he's okay? So I phoned one of my friends, a good friend of mine who lived on about the 3rd floor. I say about the 3rd floor because there was building works going on. So the floor levels lower down changed to do with some nursery or community thing that they were changing. So
yes, that's right.
I phoned him up to see how he was. He was outside. He was down on the ground floor. This was at the early stages of the fire. I asked how he was. Bearing in mind there was nothing on the news, there was nothing being reported, so I'm just thinking of fire. He said he was okay. He was looking up. He was a little bit sort of getting a bit bigger. I thought no more of it. I thought he's okay. Flat fire. That's the end of it. About 10, 15 minutes later, the guy who phoned me the first time, who was looking at the fire, phoned me back and said, this is serious. This is really, really bad. And he told me a little bit more about what he could see. Not what I could see, what he could see. And I remember the noises I could hear in the background. And he was giving me a graphic account of what he could see. And I'm going to be brutally honest with you here. I said to him, look, I need to go. I need to get off the phone because I need to go to the loo.
Right.
Which I didn't. I used it as an excuse to get off the phone.
Because you didn't want to...
I couldn't believe what he was telling me, and I didn't want to believe what I could hear in the background. I'm not going to go into the details in case some of the survivors are listening. Like I said, Grenfell, it's not my story in the sense that I wasn't in that tower block. So I phoned him back after 5 minutes, and I apologised, and I said, look, I lied to you. I lied because I didn't like what you were telling me.
Yeah.
So that was on the night of the fire. I mean, I'm going to go a little bit random, and you can decide which path you want to go.
Go on.
The next morning, I remember just seeing flames still coming from the lower floors of the building. Flames were still coming out the next day. I mean, you spoke about the sort of powers that be coming to help.
That was the bit I found hard.
It didn't exist. It didn't exist. It didn't exist. I mean, you talk about positives and negatives. Walking around the streets of North Kensington for the next 2 or 3 days, there were people of every, whatever you want, colour, creed, religion, belief, up and down the country, just there helping. I mean, that's one of my happiest, I don't know if happy's the right word.
I know what
that's one of my most positive memories.
Yes.
You walked around and you saw, you talk about a reflection. I think you mentioned earlier about a reflection in the mirror of society.
Yes.
And you have the good and the bad. So you have the people, the powers that be, whatever they want to do for whatever reasons. Oh, it's just a council estate here in North Kent. Don't worry. But then you saw the true nature of human beings and people. And it's something that I strongly believe in. That no matter how bad things are, whatever adversity you face, good will always prevail, and the good people will come together. And it's in human nature to naturally help one another and want to provide help for each other. I know. If you look at Grenfell, you look globally, we're always trying to concentrate and focus on things that divide us, and we should be angry against. We must hate our neighbours and hate but that's not what human people are about. That's not what life's about. But maybe I'm diverse and a little bit away. No, you're not.
You're oddly, Dave. You're reflecting a lot of my thoughts. Actually, you're echoing a lot of what I'm feeling, even if I haven't articulated it yet. And I don't know. When we say it's not our story, I don't know that I fully agree with you. It's obviously the tragedy belongs, for want of a better word, to the people who died and the people that they left behind. But when we talk about society and when we talk about some of the positives that you've just rather beautifully detailed, then it becomes, or it should become, all of our story, shouldn't it? In a way.
I do agree. It's just that sometimes when it's such a tragedy like this, you just feel like, that there are people like who lost their lives, families that are suffering even more every day. That's what I sort of mean by that. I mean, I'll go backwards a bit. Go back a couple of years before Grenfell. One of my there's literally a pub across the road from where your studios used to be, just down the road a little bit past the Station Tavern. There's one on the right-hand side next to Latimer Road train station.
The one with the flat roof.
That's the one. That's the exact one. I was going to name it, but I won't. I mean, that was. I spent too much time in there a few years ago, shall we say? Fair enough. And some of my friends who I said to lived in Grenfell, and some of them who survived. And again, I want to choose my words carefully. Yeah. They used to come in and you meet of a weekend or an evening or maybe 1 or 2 days when you should have been at work and you'd be having a chat about what was going on. And the stories that came out of what was happening in that tower block literally became a standing joke.
Yes.
They were that bad, and I don't want to use the word joke or comedy. Fire doors that were.
I mean, that was when I didn't discover that until I started reading Edward's blog. But the detail was extraordinary. Yep. It was scandal upon scandal upon scandal, almost to the point of, as Edward would say, and I spoke to him a few days ago, almost to the point of inevitability.
Yes, it became literally, how bad could these stories get? Door closes where doors wouldn't open or they wouldn't close. And you used to listen to you. These are your friends. These are your friends. You're sitting there, you're having a pint, and you just think, really?
Yeah.
And then, like I said, it became to the point where it was comical because then you just didn't know. And you went to complain, then it was turned on you that you were the troublemaker, you were the one causing all the problems.
That's exactly what happened.
This sounds familiar. It's no one else's fault. It's just you. Yeah. It sounds a bit like the post office. You're the only one complaining.
Yeah.
And I mean, Edward obviously was living the experience, and he was wise enough to blog it. Because if he hadn't blogged that, who would believe him? If that wasn't written down months or years before, even like the story I'm telling you now, who would believe him?
That's
if it wasn't there, if he said, "Oh, I knew this was going to," we all say, "Oh, I knew this was going to happen." Yeah. I did mention, but if he hadn't wrote that down,
that's it. That's why. Crikey, mate! I spent 20 minutes shooting my mouth off this morning, and you've just pinned down in a single sentence why that hit me so hard. Because that's the unasked question. Yeah. If he hadn't written it down, what do we think the kind of people who kept the truth about Hillsborough from the public, who sent post office sub-postmasters to jail, who tried their damnedest to keep the infected blood scandal away from the light, what would those kind of people have done with regard to Grenfell if it hadn't all been written down?
They would have just raised their eyebrows and said, "Oh yeah, of course." We do, but again, we do that as humans.
Of course.
When something happens, "Oh, we really?" But he read it down in such graphic detail. Yeah. Literally, it predicted what was going to happen.
I had to go back to it yesterday because I thought I was misremembering what you're now describing. I thought he couldn't have been that on the ball. He couldn't have been that clear and that specific about what was.
It was happening daily. Almost hourly, it was happening to the residents of Grenfell. You couldn't turn to anybody. They couldn't turn to the TMO. They couldn't turn to the council. They couldn't turn to anybody. Looking back now, but he was there living it. He was writing it down as it was happening. How haunting is that? How haunting is that?
That's exactly the right word to use. It really is. I think you've done your friends proud there, Dave. I really do.
I think it's the people of North Kensington, and if you sit back, when we all sit back in time and just look back, it's human nature. Human beings, like I said earlier on, up and down the country. That's what you try and hold on to as much as you can. I mean, you use word, when everyone else around you is telling lies. If you hold on to the truth,
that's all.
And that's what keeps. I mean, I see some members of the community that lived in Grenfell, and I see them talking, and they come on your shows. They are so articulate and so wonderful to listen to. But the way people, that's what I will always remember. Even when it upsets me and I get down, people came to, I can see it in my mind now, just walking around the streets and everybody, no matter what colour they were, what their beliefs were there helping. And That's a truly wonderful thing.
And you've done them, and you've done all of us very, very proud with those descriptions and those memories, and that one that you end with of what the streets felt like. It was so strange, that curious mixture of pure humanity in the shadow of epic tragedy. So I don't want to say everyone walked around looking dazed, but the community still doesn't feel like it felt before. It's a scar, a memory, an echo, whatever it may be. But yeah, thank God Dave was listening today, because behind all of that, of course, is the response of that community, that incredibly tight-knit community, and the diversity of it, of course, as Dave reminds us, was one of its greatest strengths. But that night, and he'd have been on the phone to his friend by about 1-2 o'clock in the morning, and people watched it happen. And this is another thing I think that is coming back to me now. You just presume that the cavalry will arrive. Do you know what I mean? And by that, I suppose in this case we mean the fire service, who were incredibly brave and ran into the building as the lucky ones were running out. But the sense as a member of the 5th largest economy in the world, or whatever statistic you prefer, it can't just carry on. They can't just carry on dying. Something's going to happen. The cavalry will arrive, and then of course the cavalry couldn't do anything for reasons that we will start discovering conclusively shortly after 11 o'clock this morning. It's 10:48. 10:51 is the time. A lot of love coming in for Dave, as you would expect, and a lot of people remembering some of the conversations that we started having 7 years ago, or 7 years ago, on June the 14th of this year. And I'm going to remind you of some of that coverage that LBC provided as a precursor to Sir Martin Moore-Bick's statement at 11 o'clock this morning, as he delivers the final report on the Grenfell Tower tragedy. But I do want to warn you that you may find some of this content distressing. I still do. And as you'll hear, I conducted some of these conversations, or contributed to some of these conversations myself. But as Dave has just reminded all of us, and if I had any doubts about playing this to you, Dave just removed them, actually, because first we look back, and then when Sir Martin Moore-Bick starts speaking today, we can begin the process of looking forwards. But be warned that some listeners may find some of this content distressing.
From Global's newsroom at 7 o'clock, a huge fire has engulfed a 27-storey block of flats in West London. It broke out at Grenfell Tower in West Kensington at around 1 o'clock this morning. 200 firefighters are still trying to put it out. This man lives on the 18th floor with his auntie and has told LBC they managed to get out.
By the time that we got downstairs, I walked out the window. I saw that the fire had come all the way up, and it was just about reaching our windows. Maybe it was at our windows by then. By the time that we walked about 100 meters and started looking up, the whole one side of the building was on fire. The cladding went up like a matchstick.
The London Ambulance Service says 30 people have been taken to 5 hospitals in the city. Residents have described seeing people flashing their mobile phone lights at the top of the building to try to get the attention of emergency services. Omar's told LBC he thinks people were trapped.
It kind of seemed to me that it was kind of impossible for people to leave their homes because the stairwell and the lifts are on fire, and it was just a whole strip, and then half an hour later the whole building's on fire. We've heard a lot of screaming from the top floor, but whether they've survived or not, we don't know.
I was at that fire from 2 a.m. this morning until probably 10 a.m. this morning.
Okay.
So, I mean, to be honest, it was, when we turned up, we couldn't see the side. There was only one side that was on fire, but within a couple of hours that whole building was completely engulfed, and it was almost like the town inferno and 9/11 rolled into one.
Oh, mate.
With the amount of debris, flaming debris, because to get into the building we had to run the gauntlet of the debris. The police was providing riot shields, so we were running a gauntlet every time we went in the lobby. Me and our crew were involved in rescues on the stairwells, on the way up to certain flats that we were detailed to go to from fire survival guidance.
Yes.
And we were just meeting people coming down the stairs in smoke. Don't know how they was breathing. We were in breathing apparatus, and we were literally carrying them down the stairs. But the amount of kit that this job has absorbed from the London Fire Brigade, it's unbelievable. It's like a war zone there.
How long have you been in the job, Terry?
27 years.
Have you seen anything even remotely like this before?
Nothing like it, ever. It's unbelievable. A building could go from being a fire in a flat, which we believe was on one of the lower floors, to the whole building, literally 100% of the building on fire. No matter what plan you had to deal with that sort of fire, that plan was going to fall down. Because there was hose going everywhere. There was one small staircase that everyone was going up. It was just like them images of 9/11. You know, we're going up the staircase and people were coming down in smoke, and it was unbelievable. I've never seen nothing like it in my life. I can't see how this is not the biggest fire we've had since the Blitz.
At 6 minutes to 1 this morning, the London Fire Brigade received the first of several calls to a fire in this premises. As you will appreciate, this is a completely unprecedented fire. In my 29 years in the London Fire Brigade, I have never seen a fire of this nature, and I have seen many high-rise fires. This will, of course, be subject to a major investigation.
We'll go to Shah, who's called from Kingston. Shah, what made you pick up the phone?
I lost my mother and my aunt in that fire, and I'm sick to death of the lies and cover-ups already started. I got a call from my aunt about 1:30 in the morning that night. She was telling me there's fire and people are dying. Please call the fire people. My mom used to live on the 18th floor, and my aunt was visiting her on that night. And they were helped up by one of the people living on the 23rd floor. He was working also with TMOs. And he was helped up despite danger to his life, and he lost his life over that. And I got a call saying, why isn't anyone helping us? They were given the wrong information. They were told to go back to their flats. I told her, you should listen to what you're told. And
sure.
You know, she said, it's the floor is hot. It's hot. We're going up the floor, and it was the smoke. My mom just keep saying, you know, don't come. I said, Mom, I'm coming. She said, don't come, just call the fire people. As they went up, helped by this Afghan man to take refuge in his flat, I kept on calling them, and I could not hear any sound of fire alarms up to the last minute. I kept telling them to put some sort of wetted cloth over themselves, wet themselves with water so the fire wouldn't affect them. I was trying to keep them calm. And the smoke suddenly got them. I mean, I heard every last breath she took. The smoke got them, and I could hear him wheezing. She couldn't talk anymore. My mom's phone was going.
Why, Shah, mate? I'm so sorry for you. I really am. Why did you use the phrase cover up?
I heard, from what I've heard so far.
Okay.
From what I've heard, that politicians are trying to spend this somehow.
They won't be able to.
Somehow.
They won't be able to.
I hope.
They won't be.
James, please don't let them. We don't have much voice in this city. We don't have many journalists which fight for us. I mean, the little people.
You just take care of yourself. Keep your family close, all right? And don't worry about cover-ups.
I hope not. Nobody helped that night. There didn't seem to be much they could have done. I mean, my aunt was saying, why aren't there helicopters? Why aren't there helicopters? Why aren't there people coming to help us? Why aren't there cranes coming? I mean, I thought I'll wake up in the middle of the night. It's a nightmare that it's not ending.
I know. You look after yourself. There won't be a cover-up. It won't be allowed to happen. We're not going to have another Hillsborough. God, don't remember saying that, but crikey, I hope I'm right. It's 11 o'clock. We're going to take the headlines with Thomas, but we may pull out, of course, if Sir Martin Moore-Bick begins his statement. And we cross live now to Sir Martin Moore-Bick, the chairman of the Grenfell Tower Inquiry.
My report on that series of events was published on the 30th of October 2019. In the second phase of the inquiry, the panel has been investigating the underlying causes of the fire with a view to identifying where mistakes were made and ensuring that a similar disaster cannot occur again. This second part of the investigations has taken longer than we had hoped, partly because of the broad scope of our terms of reference, and partly because, as our investigations progressed, we uncovered many more matters of concern than we had originally expected. As we discovered, it is not possible properly to understand the causes of the fire without understanding the way in which knowledge of the materials and methods of construction employed in the refurbishment developed over the course of time, what the government and others learnt about them, and how the regulations and guidance relating to their use developed during the same period. The information obtained in that part of our investigations provided the background to our examination of the refurbishment itself and the various decisions taken in the course of it, particularly in relation to the selection of materials. In addition, it has been necessary for us to examine the way in which fire safety at Grenfell Tower was managed, including the arrangements for fire risk assessments and the response to them, as well as the relationship between the tenant management organisation and the residents of the tower. The firefighting operations of the London Fire Brigade were considered in detail in my first report, but a number of questions relating to organisation and training could not be answered at that stage and were deferred for consideration in Phase 2. Also deferred to Phase 2 were certain questions relating to the development of the fire, including the relative contributions of the different materials used in the cladding. Another important aspect of our terms of reference was to investigate the response of the authorities to the emergency. Finally, but most importantly, it was necessary for us to investigate in as much detail as the evidence would allow the circumstances surrounding the deaths of those who perished in the fire. The report we're publishing today contains our findings on all these and other matters. However, the simple truth is that the deaths that occurred were all avoidable, and those who lived in the tower were badly failed over a number of years and in a number of different ways by those who were responsible for ensuring the safety of the building and its occupants. They include the government, the tenant management organisation, the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, those who manufactured and supplied the materials used in the refurbishment, those who certified their suitability for use on high-rise buildings, the architect, the principal contractor, and some of its subcontractors, in particularly Harley Curtain Wall and its successor Harley Facades, some of the consultants, in particular the fire engineer Exover Warrington Fire, the local authority's building control department, and the London Fire Brigade. Not all of them bear the same degree of responsibility for the eventual disaster, but as our reports show, all contributed to it in one way or another, in most cases through incompetence, but in some cases through dishonesty and greed. The failings can be traced back over many years, and our efforts to get to the bottom of what went wrong and why account for the length of our report and the time it has taken us to produce it. However, if an inquiry of this kind is to produce anything of value, it is necessary for those who can influence the future direction of the construction industry the fire and rescue services, the management of fire safety in buildings, and resilience planning to understand exactly where mistakes were made and how they can be avoided in the future. The report is divided into 14 parts, broadly by reference to related subjects. Some parts contain several chapters, some only one. As with the Phase 1 report, it begins with an introduction followed by an executive summary. Although the executive summary runs to 24 pages, the length of the report means that it can touch on only the most significant elements of our conclusions. However, it should assist readers in finding their way around the report. Part 2 describes significant events that provided the background to the fire. It begins by explaining how the regulations and guidance in force at the time of the refurbishment came into being, and the way in which the reaction to fire of materials used in the construction of modern high-rise buildings was tested. We then consider the involvement of the government in the form of the then Department for Communities and Local Government, the way in which it sought to monitor the causes of fires when they occurred, and most importantly, the warning signs that were emerging from as early as 1991 that some kinds of materials, in particular aluminium composite material panels with unmodified polyethylene cores, were dangerous. We find that there was a failure on the part of the government and others to give proper consideration at an early stage to the dangers of using combustible materials in the walls of high-rise buildings. That including failing to amend in an appropriate way the statutory guidance on the construction of external walls. That is where the seeds of the disaster were sown. In Part 3, we set out our findings about the testing and marketing of the main products used in the refurbishment: the Rainabond panels, the Celotex RS5000 insulation, and the small amount of Kingspan K15 insulation. We discovered that there had been systematic dishonesty on the part of manufacturers involving deliberate manipulation of the testing processes and calculated attempts to mislead purchasers into thinking that what were combustible materials complied with the provisions of the statutory guidance that advised against their use. That dishonest approach to marketing was compounded by the failure of two of the bodies that provided certificates of compliance with the building regulations and statutory guidance: the British Board of Agreement and Local Authority Building Control, to scrutinise the information provided to them with sufficient care and exercise the degree of rigour and independence that was to be expected of them. The tenant management organisation was at the heart of events leading up to the fire. In Part 4 of the report, we make our findings about its relationship with the residents of Grenfell Tower. We find that the organisation was badly run and failed to respond to criticisms of its treatment of residents contained in independent reports produced in 2009. It is clear that for some years before the fire, relations between the TMO and residents were marked by distrust, antagonism, and increasingly bitter confrontation. We find that for the TMO to have allowed the relationship to deteriorate to such an extent reflects a serious failure on its part to observe its basic responsibilities. Part 5 of the report is concerned with the management of fire safety at the tower. Again, we find that the residents were badly let down. The picture is one of a persistent failure to give sufficient importance to the demands of fire safety, particularly the safety of vulnerable people, and a failure on the part of the council to scrutinise that aspect of the organisation's activities adequately. Part of the reason for that was the failure of the chief executive, Robert Black, to ensure that the board of the TMO and the council were kept properly informed of matters affecting fire safety. That was despite periodic expressions of concern by the London Fire Brigade about compliance with the fire safety order, all of which should have been drawn to their attention. The TMO's failure to attach sufficient importance to fire safety is illustrated by its reliance on a single person, Carl Stokes, as fire risk assessor for its entire estate, despite his lack of qualifications and experience, by its failure to carry out necessary remedial work identified in fire risk assessments promptly, by its failure to provide measures to mitigate the absence of an effective smoke ventilation system, and by its failure to introduce appropriate arrangements for inspecting and maintaining fire prevention systems, in particular self-closing devices on the entrance doors to individual flats. In addition, the TMO failed to maintain a reasonably accurate record of those residents of the tower who were vulnerable for one reason or another and likely to need help to escape if a fire occurred. Part 6 of the report contains our findings about the refurbishment itself, and again the picture is disturbing. First, the regulatory context in which the work was carried out was, in our view, unsatisfactory because the statutory guidance, which was treated by many in the construction industry, including those engaged on the refurbishment, as containing a sufficient statement of what was required, did not make it clear enough that it was subject to the overriding requirements of the building regulations. That was a particular problem in relation to the rain screen panels, which, although they satisfied the requirement in the guidance for a material with a Class 0 surface, contained a highly combustible core. But that is only the beginning. The tenant management organisation, as the client, manipulated the process of appointing an architect to design the refurbishment in order to avoid the need to invite open tenders for the architectural services. It did so because it wanted to appoint Studio E, the architect for the existing Academy and Leisure Centre project, despite the fact that it had no experience of overcladding a high-rise building. That turned out to have significant consequences because Studio E failed to recognise, as a reasonably competent architect should have done, that the insulation and rain screen chosen for the refurbishment were combustible and unsuitable for that purpose. ACM panels were chosen as the rain screen to keep down the cost. Neither Ryden, the principal contractor, nor Harley, its cladding subcontractor, was aware of the properties of the materials specified for use in the refurbishment, although Harley, as a specialist subcontractor dealing with cladding, should have been, and Ryden, as principal contractor, had its own responsibility to ensure the materials were suitable. One of the problems that afflicted the refurbishment was a failure on the part of all concerned to understand where responsibility for any particular decision lay. That was especially the case in relation to the choice of the rain screen. The generally prevailing view was that since aluminium composite material panels had been used on other buildings without apparent problems, they were suitable for use on the tower. But no one was prepared to accept responsibility for having chosen them, and when questioned, everyone who was asked said that someone else had been responsible for ensuring that they were suitable. We find that Studio E, Ryden and Harley all took an unacceptably casual approach to contractual relations. None of their employees engaged on the project understood the relevant provisions of the building regulations, the statutory guidance, or such guidance from industry sources as was then available. That might not have mattered quite so much if proper advice had been taken from a competent and experienced fire engineer, or if building control had performed its task properly. In fact, the tenant management organisation did instruct Exover Warrington Fire to produce a fire safety strategy for the refurbishment, which should have included advice on the effect of the overcladding and the compliance of the external walls with the functional requirements of the building regulations. Exover produced 3 versions of a fire safety strategy, but each version was stated to be a draft and was incomplete because it did not deal with that particular question, which it said would be covered in a future issue of the report. It was clear, therefore, that the fire safety strategy was incomplete, but no one asked Exover to finish its work, nor did anyone provide it with details of the proposed cladding to enable it to do so. Exover itself failed to ask for the missing information or to complete the work it had been instructed to carry out. The failure to obtain a final report was probably critical, because if Exover had considered the proposed cladding, it should, and probably would, have identified the fact that the insulation and the rain screen did not comply with the statutory guidance or, more importantly, the building regulations. In Part 8, we set out our findings on the management and training of the London Fire Brigade in the years leading up to the fire. That part of our investigations represented a continuation of the work started in Phase 1, in which I described the response of the LFB on the night. I was critical of certain aspects of that response, in particular the way in which the control room handled calls from people trapped in the building, and the actions of some of the incident commanders who had not been properly trained to deal with a fire of that nature. That made it necessary for us to examine the London Fire Brigade's management and training in the period leading up to the fire, as well as the way in which it made use of the information available to it. In our report, we find that there were deficiencies in the organisation and management of the control room, the training of control room officers, and in the commissioning and delivery of training to operational crews, in particular in relation to incident command. There were also deficiencies in the collection of information needed to enable crews to prepare effectively to respond to fires in individual buildings. The primary cause of those problems was a chronic lack of effective leadership, combined with an undue emphasis on process and an attitude of complacency. We have also returned to investigate some aspects of the firefighting operations on the night of the fire, on which I was unable to make findings in Phase 1, in particular problems with communications and the supply of water. I shall return to Part 9 of the report in a moment, but for now I move to Part 10, in which we examine the authorities' response to the fire. Once again, we have found that those who lost their homes as a result of the fire were badly let down by the organisations that should have provided the support they desperately needed. The primary responsibility for that lay with the Council, which, as a Category 1 responder under the Civil Contingencies Act, should have had plans in place to enable it to respond effectively to the emergency. In the event, however, it had failed to put in place suitable plans or to provide the training to its staff that was required to enable it to respond effectively to the situation it faced. In addition, its chief executive was ill-suited to taking control of what was undoubtedly a very serious challenge. The Council did not have the capacity to identify those who needed accommodation and other important forms of assistance, nor did it have arrangements in place for communicating with those affected by the disaster or the wider public. As a result, it was not capable of meeting the immediate needs of those who had been displaced and from their homes for food and shelter. In the end, it was local, voluntary and community organisations that filled the gap by providing rest centres and temporary shelter. The London-wide resilience structures that were intended to enable the capital to respond to an emergency affecting more than one borough did not operate effectively, partly because they were not designed to provide central direction to the response, and partly because the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea did not seek assistance promptly. In the event, the government, in the form of a senior official in the Department for Communities and Local Government, brokered an arrangement under which the experienced town clerk of the City of London took control of the operation. An important chapter of this part records the evidence given by those who were personally affected by the fire. We are acutely aware that giving evidence, particularly giving evidence in public, was a difficult and daunting experience. We should therefore like to thank all of those who contributed to our investigations by giving evidence, both in the form of witness statements and by being willing to speak about their experiences in public. By doing so, they ensured that we received the fullest possible account of the events that unfolded in the days following the fire. In parts 11, 12 and 13 of the report, we deal with a number of different matters, including the experiments carried out by Professor Bisbee and Professor Torero on the materials used in the refurbishment. They confirmed that the Renabond aluminium composite material panels were the primary reason for the fire's devastating progress. Part 14 contains our recommendations. Although some steps have already been taken to respond to the many failures that we have identified, we think that more can and should be done to bring about a fundamental change in the attitudes and practices of the construction industry. Only such a change can ensure that in future buildings in general and higher risk buildings in particular are safe for those who live and work in them. We think that in different ways implementation of our recommendations will improve fire safety, particularly in high-rise buildings, and ensure that dangerous materials cannot be used in construction in the future. They will also improve the efficiency of fire and rescue services nationally. Our recommendations include, but are not limited to, the following: the appointment of a construction regulator to oversee all aspects of the construction industry, bringing responsibility for all aspects of fire safety under one government department, the establishment of a body of professional fire engineers properly regulated and with protected status, and the introduction of mandatory fire safety strategies for higher risk buildings, a licensing scheme for contractors wishing to undertake the construction or refurbishment of higher risk buildings, the regulation and mandatory accreditation of fire risk assessors, the establishment of a College of Fire and Rescue to provide practical, educational and managerial training to fire and rescue services, and the introduction of a requirement for the government to maintain a publicly accessible record of recommendations made by select committees, coroners and public inquiries, describing the steps taken in response to them or its reasons for declining to implement them. I now return to part 9 of the report, which is the most personal part and contains the most difficult reading. It contains a detailed account of the circumstances surrounding the deaths of those who perished in the fire. I did not refer to it earlier because it seemed to me fitting to end these proceedings as they began in May 2018 with a reminder that the fire at Grenfell Tower was above all a human tragedy in which many lives were lost, families were torn asunder, homes were destroyed, and a community was shattered. The detailed reconstruction we have provided will be for many one of the most important parts of our report. Although it may make painful reading, those who lost relatives and friends naturally feel a need to know as much as possible about their loved ones' last moments. I said on many occasions that I hoped we could find sufficient facts to satisfy the coroner of the circumstances surrounding their deaths and avoid the need for any further proceedings. I'm now able to say that we've been able to make detailed findings about the circumstances in which people died, including calls made to the emergency services, the transfer of information from the control room to the incident ground, the recording of that information on its way to and at the bridgehead, and the steps taken to rescue those who were trapped. We are satisfied that all those who died in the building were overcome by toxic gases produced by the fire, and with expert assistance, we've been able to establish a reasonably accurate time of death in each case. We're satisfied that all those whose bodies were damaged by the fire were already dead by the time it reached them. In a moment, my fellow panel members, Ms. Istefan and Mr. Akbor, wish to add some comments of their own. Before they do so, however, I should like to thank the inquiry team, without whom it would not have been possible to carry out an investigation of this kind. It would be invidious to single out individual names for mention on this occasion, because everyone involved, whatever their particular task, has played an essential part in enabling us to do our work. With their help, we have followed up many lines of inquiry, some of which led to surprising revelations, and have collected and digested a huge number of documents and statements, not to mention hearing many days of oral evidence. All those who worked for the inquiry over the years are named in an appendix to the report, and we owe them a deep debt of gratitude. I now invite Mr. Estefan to say a few words.
Thank you, Sir Martin. Good morning. Before I joined the inquiry panel, I spent nearly 30 years as an architect. In that role, I developed a particular interest in health and safety, fire, and accessibility matters. Returning home from a holiday in June 2017, I flew over West London and saw the burning tower in the early hours from the air. As for so many others, this was a profound shock. First, of course, as a human response, but also as a professional who had spent their career working to make buildings safe. Throughout this inquiry, we have been determined to find out how such a disaster was possible and what needs to be done to save lives in the future. As Sir Martin has just summarised, we have found many failings across a wide range of institutions, organisations and individuals that spanned many years, which together have led to the terrible fire at Grenfell Tower. They include many failures of the construction industry, my own sector, which is where I will focus my comments on today. Since the fire, the government has passed the Building Safety Act. The Act is welcome, but we need to go further. Our report identifies what we think is needed to make sure the legacy of Grenfell is real and brings about lasting and progressive change. Our recommendations place new burdens and responsibilities on people and organisations. I make no apologies for that. Put simply, if you work in the construction industry and you do not feel the weight of responsibility you have for for keeping people safe, you are in the wrong job. The change we need to bring about is partly about structures and regulations. Sir Martin has set out the key points in what we have proposed, and the report explains our recommendations in detail. But the necessary change is also one of culture and behaviours. Change on this scale needs to be owned and led by those of us working in the sector. It is not enough to pass an Act of Parliament and to sit back and think the work is done. Without change in behaviour and a recognition that the needs of the people who use our buildings must be placed at the centre of our work, the lessons of Grenfell will not truly be learnt in full. One of the core themes of our report is technical incompetence of many of those involved in the refurbishment project. As hundreds of other buildings are now known to have similar cladding systems, it is clear that the problem of incompetence is widespread. It follows that part of the change that is needed to the culture of the industry is an ongoing commitment to the development of professional skills. If we are not professionally curious, we will not become technically competent. Again, this change needs everyone in the construction industry to play their part in the implementation of the inquiry's recommendations. We must also keep at the very forefront of our minds our responsibilities towards those who are most vulnerable. At Grenfell, a significant number of those who died were children, had disabilities, or were vulnerable in other ways. The risks posed by a particular building and the right response to those risks are always as diverse as the people who live or work in it. That is why we recommend that the government thinks again about defining higher risk buildings solely by reference to their height. It is why the fire safety strategies must be provided for safety of all occupants. And it is why a stay-put strategy will never be appropriate where there is a risk of fire spreading over the building's external walls. It is why we recommend that the government guidance should be reviewed so that the safety and resilience of a building is prioritised. And it is why we stand by the inquiry's Phase 1 recommendation that the need for PEEPs, personal emergency evacuation plans, for residents with mobility issues or other impairments. As an inquiry panel, we have acted throughout with fairness, independence and impartiality. That is what the law requires. At the same time, the losses so many people have suffered and my involvement in this process has left a mark on me as a person and as a professional which will last far beyond this inquiry. And although this inquiry is now ending, we know that for many people their journey continues. We wish them strength for the future. I will now hand over to my colleague Ali.
Thank you, Thoraya. Good morning, everyone. My role as a panel member has been to listen to the evidence, to consider what I have heard, and work with Sir Martin and Thoraya to agree findings and recommendations. Firstly, I would like to express my own heartfelt sympathy to all those whose lives have been affected by this tragic fire. We know that an inquiry can feel like a very slow process. But what I can say is that we have been painstakingly thorough and that we present our report to you with confidence in its veracity. Secondly, I would like to say that I grew up in council housing. I was involved in creating social housing organisations. I was chief executive of a housing association for over 20 years. What I can say is that working on the inquiry has had a profound impact on me personally and as a social housing professional. In social housing, we often say that we put our tenants at the heart of what we do. But it is not enough just to pay lip service to that ideal. In our report, we look at the relationship between Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation and its residents before the fire. We find that it was one of distrust, dislike, personal antagonism, and anger. Residents deserve to be treated with understanding and respect. The TMO failed to do that. We saw a similar failure to treat residents as people and as individuals in the aftermath of the fire, including in the way that those with religious, cultural, or social needs suffered discrimination as a result of RBKC's failure to prepare properly for emergencies. It was obvious to me from watching and listening to evidence being given at the hearing that there were two different groups of people, those who lived at Grenfell and those who worked for the TMO, RBKC and their agents. In our report, we set out how the government's focus on deregulation dominated the department's thinking such that even matters affecting the safety of life were ignored, delayed, or disregarded. The deregulation agenda had a parallel impact on social housing, on the social housing sector, particularly in terms of consumer standards and protection for tenants. The effects of that can be seen in the many failings of the TMO, which we set out in our report, and which were not prevented or addressed by the regulatory system then in place. Parliament has now passed the Social Housing Regulation Act, which will enhance the powers of the regulator in support of stronger consumer standards and which stresses the need for involvement and empowerment of tenants and the reintroduction of inspection of landlords. In my view, this was not a moment too soon. Our report underlines why its full implementation is so important and so urgent. I have focused so far on the TMO's role as a social housing provider. The TMO played an important part in the refurbishment of Grenfell Tower in its role as the project's client. We have found that the TMO paid insufficient care in its choice of architect and failed to pay enough attention to fire safety. I hope that our report acts as a reminder to the clients of future building projects, including social housing providers, that they have a responsibility to the users of their buildings to ensure that safety is not sacrificed to the demands of speed and cost. Regulation should not be treated as boxes to be ticked, but as a way of giving residents confidence that their homes are safe. Finally, I would like to echo something that Thoraya has said. We cannot, in a few words here today, do full justice to the totality of our report. What is needed is for those with responsibility for building safety, in my sector as in Thoraya's, to read the report, to reflect on it, and to treat Grenfell as a touchstone in all that they do in the future. And that is to act with professionalism, with competence, and to put people first. I will now pass you back to Sir Martin.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We should all remember that the Grenfell Tower fire was and remains an intensely personal tragedy for all those who lived in and around the tower, and above all, for those who died, their families and friends. We invite you, therefore, to join us in remembering them while I read out their names. Fathia Ahmed El Sanusi, Abu Fras Mohammed Ibrahim, Isra Ibrahim, Mohammed Amid Sabah Neda, Hesham Rahman, Rania Ibrahim, Fethia Hassan, Hania Hassan, Marco Gottardi, Gloria Trevisan, Raymond Herbert Moses Bernard, Esla El Gouachri, Mariam El Gouachri, Anthony Keith Disson, Bassem Choucair, Nadia Choucair, Mirna Choucair, Fatima Choucair, Zainab Choucair, Syria Choucair, Hashim Kadir, Noura Jamal, Yahya Hashim, Firdoz Hashim, Yaqub Hashim, Abdulaziz El-Wahabi, Fazia El-Wahabi, Yassin El-Wahabi, Nur Huda El-Wahabi, Mehdi El-Wahabi, Ligaya Moore, Jessica Urbano Ramirez, Omar Belkadi, Farah Hamdan, Malak Belkadi, Lena Belkadi, Mary Mendy, Khadija Say, Victoria King, Alexandra Atala, Mohammed Nur Tuku, Amal Ahmadine, Amaya Tuku Ahmadine, Amna Mahmoud Idris, Majri Vital, Ernie Vital, Debbie Lamprell, Gary Maunders, Bekti Haftom, Baruch Haftom, Hamid Khani, Isaac Paulos, Sakina Afrasahabi, Fatime Afrasiabi, Vincent Chijina, Khadija Kalufi, Kamru Mia, Rabea Begum, Mohammed Hamid, Mohammed Hanif, Husna Begum, Joseph Daniels, Sheila, Steve Power, Zainab Dean, Jeremiah Dean, Mohammed Al-Hajali, Dennis Murphy, Ali Yahwa Jafari, Abdeslam Sabah, Logan Gomez, Billy Burton. Thank you all very much.
Sir Martin Moore-Bick there, the chair of the Grenfell Inquiry, concluding his press conference, unveiling his final report by commemorating the 71 people who died that night and the one who died subsequently of injuries sustained. We've just been hearing from Sir Martin, from Toria Istefan, an inquiry panel member and architect, and that description also applies to the other man whose voice you heard, Ali Akbar. The time is coming up to 11:45. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. 1,700 pages of report, albeit with an executive summary that Sir Martin referred to. And we will start looking at some of the key or headline elements of what, for me at least, appears to have done the job. It appears to have reached the parts that that last caller that we heard from, Shah, just before Sir Martin started talking, feared would not be reached. 11:48 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we process or digest the findings of Sir Martin Moore-Bick and his recently released 1,700-page report into the Grenfell Tower Inquiry, the Phase 2 report. I have responses from the London Fire Brigade and indeed from the Metropolitan Police. But Charlotte Lynch had an early look at the report and joins me now from Grenfell Tower. I think, Charlotte, that the key words to extrapolate from the report are greed and dishonesty, but it is the greed and dishonesty of material suppliers in the first instance that was most shocking, I think.
Yeah, absolutely, James. I mean, it's failure and dishonesty and total lack of care on every level, really. And that's from government down. In fact, it finds several failures within government that almost opened the door for these private firms to completely exploit weak building regulations in the UK. It's found that ministers were repeatedly warned of the dangers of the combustible cladding as early as 1991 and were well aware by 2016, the year before the fire, but did not act. In fact, even after a similar fire, which killed 6 people in 2009 in Camberwell, the Lakanal House fire, the government continued to pursue a deregulatory agenda, which the inquiry said, quote, dominated the department's thinking so much that matters affecting the safety of life were ignored, delayed, or disregarded. Now, this allowed those who made and sold the cladding and then eventually put it on the building to completely take advantage of that. In fact, it found one company which was responsible for manufacturing the screens, the rain screens that you heard referred to there. This is a company called Arconic Architectural Products, was determined, the inquiry said, to exploit the weak regulation in the UK, despite recognising the danger. Several other private companies are named who it said were deliberately dishonest, engaged in this deliberate, sustained, systemic strategies to manipulate the testing process. I just want to read you what it's found about one of those in particular, because this for me is unbelievable. The firm Celotex, which manufactured the insulation that was used within the cladding in those rain screens, was found to have actually manipulated a safety test to ensure it would pass. It said that this was done in an attempt to break into the market. It tested its product with 2 sets of fire-resistant boards placed in critical positions to
Charlotte, I'm going to come back to you because Natasha Elcock now is giving a press conference on behalf of Grenfell United.
Of a painful 6 years, listening to the advice that contributed to the deaths of 54 adults and 18 children. They were our loved ones, our neighbours and our friends. Today's report speaks to the lack of competence, understanding and fundamental failure to perform the most basic duties of care. We paid the price of systematic dishonesty, institutional indifference and neglect. The government ignored warnings about dangerous cladding from as early as 1991. It knew the risks but failed to prevent them, revealing the greed and profiteering of an industry that has been poorly regulated by governments over decades. It uncovers the systematic failings at the TMO and RBKC, which created a toxic, calculated culture which marginalised its residents. It shows the senior management at the London Fire Brigade knew about the risk of cladding fires but did nothing to prepare. But above all, the judge concludes what we already knew, that every single loss of life that night was avoidable. Human life was never a priority, and we lost friends, neighbours and loved ones in the most horrific way through greed, corruption, incompetence and negligence. The recommendations published today are basic safety principles that should already exist, highlighting how the government's role, duties and obligations have been hollowed out by privatisation. Where voids were created as the government outsourced their duties, Kingspan, Celotex and Arconic filled the gaps with substandard and combustible materials. They were allowed to manipulate the testing regimes, fraudulently and knowingly market their products as safe. Today, we send a message to Keir Starmer and his government. This country has been failed by governments of all political persuasions. Our expectation is your government will break old habits and implement all the recommendations made by Sir Martin Moore-Bick's report without further delay, because the time to address this is already 3 decades too late. For the report to be worth anything, it must be and bring systematic change. To prevent another tragedy like Grenfell, your government needs to create something that doesn't exist. You must become a government with the power and ability to separate itself from the construction industry and corporate lobbying. A government that prioritises and tackles the glaring structural injustices and social and racial inequalities of the people you serve. You must now finally make this the turning point for Britain. To the police and the Crown Prosecution Service, it's now on to you to deliver justice, to bring charges to those culpable for the deaths of our loved ones. We would like to thank the public for their continuous support of the bereaved survivors and the Grenfell community. You were there for us when it happened. We ask for you to continue to stand with us, to stand for what's right and help us in holding those responsible to account. Finally, to the 54 adults and 18 children whose lives got cut short in the most violent way, we will never give up fighting for justice for you, and you will forever be in our hearts.
James
Thank you.
O'Brien on LBC.
5 minutes to 12 is the time. That was Natasha Elcock reading a statement on behalf of Grenfell United in response to what we have been following since 11 o'clock this morning and discussing since 10 o'clock, the final chapter, the phase 2 of Sir Martin Moore-Bick and his colleagues' inquiry into the Grenfell Tower tragedy. Back to Grenfell Tower, where Charlotte Lynch was speaking to us, and we'll hear a few more minutes from Charlotte, but then we will cross live to the House of Commons for PMQs, which I think will begin with a statement from Keir Starmer, whom you just heard being directly addressed by Natasha Elcock with her call for a break with the past, a change, if you like, in governmental approach to these matters, because the accusations, or rather the findings, lay responsibility at the door of several governments, not just the government of David Cameron, which of course presided over a programme of weapons-grade deregulation, and it is that we were talking about, Charlotte. So we've only got a couple of minutes, but that notion of deregulation coupled with corporate greed.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what's laid bare in this report. And then, of course, as well, you've heard referred to the TMO, the Tenant Management Organisation. Now, that's the body essentially responsible for managing the tenants that were within the Grenfell Tower. And it was their responsibility to choose who it was employing to install the cladding when the building was refurbished. And it chose that material, it's said in this report, because it was the cheapest option available, because it was so cheap, but it also didn't take care and attention to actually look at those it was employing and ask themselves whether or not they were going to do a good enough job. And it was those contractors who actually just almost thought that everybody else was going to do it. Everybody else was looking at fire safety, this said. So there was no need or no desire, no determination amongst any of them, it seemed, to make sure that that was being properly checked. But if they had, they would have found that this material didn't comply with the guidance. It didn't comply with the building regulations, but nobody checked. In fact, it was said that contractors had a cavalier attitude to fire safety. Harley, you heard mentioned, one of those subcontractors employed to install the cladding, was singled out, saying that firm appears to have thought there was no need to consider fire safety because others would simply do so. The architect employed that the Tenant Management Organisation was said to have been determined to employ, Studio E, was said to bear very significant responsibility for the disaster. They were responsible for choosing that material. And another firm, Exavert, the company instructed to carry out a fire safety strategy for the building, never actually completed it. And nobody instructed to do that even visited the tower, but then no one checked whether or not it had been done. Nobody asked for that fire safety strategy once the works were complete. So that, crucially, is now in some of these key recommendations, a statutory requirement for a fire safety strategy to be produced by somebody who is actually a registered fire engineer for the construction or refurbishment of any of what is deemed as a higher risk building. That is currently deemed as buildings above 18 metres in height, although there are now calls for that to be changed as well. And that profession of fire engineer, it's recommended that it should be protected in law, and government should recognise it. They should increase the number of courses available for people to actually study to become a fire engineer, because what it says is at the minute, essentially anybody can do that job without the proper qualifications. Amongst the other key recommendations, James, just quickly, the government should bring responsibility for fire safety into one singular department. It currently isn't, with one single Secretary of State as well. And they say that Secretary of State should appoint a role of Chief Construction Advisor.
Hard to imagine the current government not acting on some of those immediately and completely. Charlotte Lynch, many thanks. I don't know if we'll catch up with you further later. We are very much defined by events at the moment. And speaking of events, PMQs is set to start in the House of Commons with Natasha Clark. I believe a statement from Keir Starmer about the Grenfell Tower inquiry to open proceedings this afternoon.
Yes, we're expecting just at the top of Prime Minister's questions for the Prime Minister to nod essentially to what will be a full statement at 12:30, where he will in detail give a full statement, but just to sort of probably pay tribute to the families, to the victims, and to talk about how he will be implementing some of the recommendations from this report. No, we don't exactly know which he will be nodding to, but I imagine that's where we'll start with Prime Minister's questions, a bit more of a sombre tone today. Of
course, and Rishi Sunak will be there. Is he still leader of the Conservative Party? Forgive, I'm not being flippant.
It's either interim or acting leader.
But he's still there. He's back from California or whatever.
And so we will be hearing from his response as well.
OK, so we'll cross live to the House of Commons as soon as the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, gets to his feet. And I suspect we'll stay there for the 12:30 statement as well from Keir Starmer, where he will, as Natasha has just explained, go into more detail on the question of the government's response, perhaps, to the findings of Sir Martin Moore-Bick's inquiry. Will it be, I mean, you've used the word sombre already quite correctly, but once that statement is made, Rishi Sunak will be asking questions about the government's performance in recent weeks, not about the events of 7 years ago.
I imagine that's what Rishi Sunak will focus
so what might come up
today in Prime Minister's questions. But yes, I think, like I say, I think he will be probably able
I think we're going to cross now. No, I beg your pardon. Carry on.
Sorry.
How can you not realise that? I was just interrupting you for completely unnecessary reasons. No, now we're going live to that.
We want to congratulate our Team GB Olympic and Paralympic athletes and support staff for their outstanding achievements so far. Mr. Speaker, yesterday's incident in the Channel was shocking and deeply tragic, and our thoughts are with all those who've lost their lives and their families. We must have a renewed determination to end this. And Mr. Speaker, the chair of the Grenfell Tower Inquiry, Sir Martin Moore-Bick, has today published the inquiry's Phase 2 report. And I know that the whole House will be, thoughts of the House will be with the bereaved and the survivors of the Grenfell Power tragedy and the residents in the immediate community. I will be making a statement shortly after PMQs today. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, and in addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later.
Bill Esterson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I associate myself with the Prime Minister's remarks about the loss of life in the Channel and about Grenfell? The latest suicide figures are a sobering reminder of the misery caused by mental ill health. McGall Health Park in my constituency is a centre of excellence with high, medium and low security hospitals on the same site. The staff do an amazing job, but demand has gone through the roof, especially since the pandemic. Does my right honourable friend agree that it is essential that we have the same level of priority for mental health care and physical health care in this country?
Yes, and I thank my honourable friend for raising this critical issue. I think so many are affected by the tragedy of suicide. I'm pleased to hear about the work that he refers to, but 1 million people are not getting the support, the mental health support that they need. And that is why we will recruit 8,500 mental health workers to treat adults and children, and bring forward legislation to modernise the Mental Health Act, an act which I think is well overdue for modernisation. Thank you.
We come to the Leader of the Opposition, Rishi Sunak.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I join with the Prime Minister in paying tribute to the Grenfell community? And we're going to rightly discuss that important issue shortly after PMQs. Can I also join him in congratulating our record-breaking Olympians and Paralympians on everything that they have achieved? And lastly, could I just pay tribute to the hard work, bravery and dedication of our police? This summer, in challenging circumstances, they served our communities commendably and kept us all safe. Now, Mr. Speaker, government is about making choices, and the new Prime Minister has made a choice. He has chosen to take the winter fuel allowance away from low-income pensioners and give that money to certain unionised workforces in inflation-busting pay rises. So can I just ask the Prime Minister, why did he choose train drivers over Britain's vulnerable pensioners?
Mr. Speaker, this government was elected to clear up the mess left by the party opposition and to bring about the change that the country desperately needs. Our first job was to audit the books, and what we found was a £22 billion black hole. Well, it's no good them complaining. Richard Hughes, the chair of the OBR, was very clear. He described it as one of the largest year-over-overspends against forecast outside of the pandemic. His words. So we've had to take tough decisions to stabilise the economy and repair the damage, including targeting winter fuel payments whilst protecting pensioners. 800,000 pensioners are not taking up pension credit. We intend to turn that around. We're going to align housing benefit and pension credit, something the previous government deferred year after year after year. And because of our commitment to the triple lock, pensions are projected to increase by over £1,000 in the next 5 years.
Rishi Sunak.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister also inherited inflation back at target, interest rates being cut, unemployment low, and indeed the fastest growing economy in the G7, Mr. Speaker. But that's not the point, because the Prime Minister now has to start taking responsibility for his own decision. And if, as he says, the public finances are a priority, it was his decision, and his decision alone, to award a train driver on £65,000 a pay rise of almost £10,000. And it was also his decision that a pensioner living on just £13,000 will have their winter fuel allowance removed. So can the Prime Minister explain to Britain's low-income pensioners why he has taken money away from them whilst at the same time given more money to highly paid train drivers?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we spent the whole election with him trying to tell the country that everything was fine, and this is the result they got. A massive mandate on this side to change the country. And if he carries on pretending everything is fine for ordinary people across the country, they're going to be there for a very, very long time. And I remind him that we inherited absolute chaos from the party opposite. We lost an average of 3 million working days a year to strikes under his watch. And you cannot fix the economy if the trains don't work, and you can't fix the economy if the NHS isn't working. And when it comes to winter fuel payments, they're having a competition, as I understand. They're going to be voting later on today. Well, his shadow housing minister, we found this. She's the favourite, I think. Some of them will be probably voting for her this afternoon. She said, her words, "I have people in my constituency telling me they don't need winter fuel payments. Why do we not have a more sophisticated mechanism for mean testing?" That's their favourite, I think, in the contest that they are having.
Mr. Speaker, again, the Prime Minister talked about the public finances. The UK's public finances are more robust than almost that of any other major advanced economy. Here we have it. He inherited a lower deficit than France, America, Italy.
Order. When I do point you to be quiet, I do mean it. I don't need a reaction back like that.
Well, the UK currently has a lower deficit than France, America, Italy and Japan. It has the second lowest debt in the entire G7. And he opposed every difficult decision that we took to deliver that. So I certainly am not going to take any lectures from him on that, Scott. But he talked about protecting ordinary people. Well, last year, under the Conservative government, a low-income pensioner with just £13,000 received not only the winter fuel payment, but also hundreds of pounds of additional cost of living support, both of which he has now scrapped. Age UK have said cutting the winter fuel allowance is the wrong policy. And only this morning, we've learnt that the vast majority of the poorest pensioners in poverty, are going to see that vital support removed. So can he tell the House, very specifically to the pensioners that are watching, how much less support a pensioner on £13,000 will receive this winter?
He talks about tough decisions. It's tough to inherit £22 billion black hole, which the OBR did not need. That is the inheritance. That's what they left. Now, back when they were in government, they'd have pretended it wasn't there. They'd have walked past it, put it in the long grass. We're not going to do that because we were elected to change this country for the better and stabilise our economy. No Prime Minister wants to do what we have to do in relation to the winter fuel allowance, but we have to take the tough decision to stabilise our economy to ensure that we can grow it for the future. And as I've said, we are working hard on pension credit. We're allowing housing benefits, which they didn't do for years, and over 5 years, it's a projected increase of up to £1,000 for those on pensions. We are tough decisions that they done.
The government doesn't have to choose to take money off low-income pensioners in order to give it to highly paid train drivers. That is a choice that he has made, and it will be clear to any pensioners watching that he simply can't explain why he has made that choice. But, Mr. Speaker, turning to another important issue. The government has suspended 30 of the UK's 350 arms export licences to Israel. It's a decision that the Chief Rabbi says beggars belief and will encourage our shared enemies. Can the Prime Minister therefore explain how his decision will help to secure the release of the 101 hostages still being held by Hamas?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, can I start by saying I think the whole House will be shocked by the horrific killing of 6 hostages in the last few days. And I know I speak for the whole House when I say that. The remaining hostages must be released. And we need a ceasefire to ensure that that can happen, that aid desperately needed can get into the region, and we can begin the path to a two-state solution. Now, he asks how we arrived at this decision. He knows very well, because the legal framework is clear. The latest guidance was issued in 2021 under his government. And that means that licences have to be kept under review, as they were by his government. And I think he probably knows the advice that was given to his government. He understands the framework. We've carried out the review in the same way and come to a clear legal conclusion. And shared that conclusion, the assessment, with Parliament. We will, of course, continue to stand by Israel's right to self-defence. But it is important that we are a country committed to the international rule of law. That gives us the strength of argument with our allies on important issues. This is a difficult issue, I recognise that, but it's a legal decision, not a policy decision. And the Prime Minister knows the framework, and they issued the guidance, they know what the test is, that test has been assessed, we've come to a conclusion, and we've put that before the House to consider.
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the Prime Minister's answer, but he'll know that decisions like this also have important and broader geopolitical implications. And he mentioned allies. It's essential that we maintain transatlantic unity in the face of terrorist threats and avoid any perception of splits between our two nations. So can he therefore update the House or tell the House what engagement he had with the United States prior to taking this significant decision?
Prime Minister.
I acknowledge the importance of working with our allies on all issues, as we have been doing, as I was able to make very clear at the NATO summit that I attended in the early summer. And of course, as he would expect, as the House would expect, we have talked this through with our allies. They understand. They have a different legal system. That is the point they made. He chunters from the start. This is a serious issue. It requires serious consideration. And the Prime Minister knows the legal framework. He knows the legal framework very well. He also knows that applying that framework, the facts of that framework, and arriving at a decision does not permit me to simply then say I'm not going to implement the legal decision and conclusion that's been reached. I don't think he's really inviting me to do that.
Mr. Speaker, not only do these decisions have geopolitical consequences, but they also have emotional ones too. And the Prime Minister took this action on the very same day as the funerals of Israeli hostages murdered by Hamas. It's something that the Board of Deputies described as a terrible, terrible message to be sending. And I hope the Prime Minister understands the hurt that has been caused, and can he take this opportunity to reassure Israel and the Jewish community that the United Kingdom and this House stands behind Israel and its right to self-defence.
Prime Minister.
Let me be very clear about that. I've said it before, I'll say it again. We absolutely recognise and support Israel's right to self-defence and have taken action in support of that right of self-defence. And I've made that repeatedly clear in all of my engagements with Israel across the region and with all of our allies. I absolutely stand by that. But in relation to licences, this isn't an Israel issue. It's the framework for all licences that have to be kept under review. It's the same test for all licences, as the Prime Minister knows. And having applied the law to the facts and come to a legal conclusion, I don't think the Prime Minister is really inviting me to put that to one side. We have to, the Leader of the Opposition. This is a serious issue. We either comply with international law or we don't. And we only have strength in our arguments because we comply with international law. I appreciate the party opposite didn't think that international law mattered, and that's why we got into that difficulty.
What happened?
Mr. Speaker, I welcome the Home Office's decision to close the Bibby Stockholm barge in my constituency. We all know this barge is a gimmick. First, it arrived late. Second, it cost the taxpayer a fortune. Third, it was laden with fire and disease risks. And fourth, it likely contributed to the death of a 27-year-old asylum seeker on board. So can the Prime Minister reassure my constituents that this unworkable gimmick and similar unworkable gimmicks will be closed down as we clear up the mess from the party opposite?
I thank my honourable friend for the question. Unlike the party opposite, we won't waste money on gimmicks. And that's why within days we ended the Rwanda scheme, we announced the launch of the Border Security Force, and we're preparing legislation to introduce counter-terrorism powers to tackle gangs. And in the first 2 months, we've removed more than 400 people on planes who had no right to be here. Compare that with the 4 volunteers sent to Rwanda that cost £700 million. This is a government of service, not a government of gimmicks.
Here comes the Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Shrub Davy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I echo the Prime Minister's words about the terrible tragedy at Grenfell, welcome the inquiry and look forward to the statement we'll discuss shortly. Mr. Speaker, for the last 18 years, Norman has been a full-time carer for his wife, Ros, who has MS and Alzheimer's disease. Earlier this year, he was forced to go back to work to earn the extra money for the costs of caring for his wife. As their income is just a few £100s above the limit for pension credit, they're set to lose their winter fuel allowance unless the Prime Minister listens to these benches and others and changes this plan. So, if he doesn't, what advice does the Prime Minister have to Norman and Ros and millions of struggling pensioners as they face rising heating bills this winter?
Prime Minister.
I thank the honourable member for raising that important question. I know how much he, both politically and personally, has championed carers. We have taken a difficult decision, and I'm not pretending it's not a difficult decision. Of course it's a difficult decision. because we have to stabilise the economy. We have to stabilise the economy. We went through, the first thing the Chancellor did was an audit. She found £22 billion worth of unfunded spending commitments. We can't walk past that. We can't pretend it doesn't exist. That's what the last government did. We have to take tough decisions. We will put all the support in that we can, obviously talk to the learned gentleman about this, but we have to take the tough decisions in relation to this. They walked away from those decisions. That what got us into the mess in the first place. You can't grow your economy, you can't fix your economy unless you stabilise it first.
Ed Davey.
Can I say to the Prime Minister, we recognise the appalling financial problems left to him by the last Conservative government, but can I say no one understands the difficult decisions you need to take to balance the books as unpaid family carers like Norman. So many millions of pensioners have struggled over recent years thanks to the last government. The number of pensioners who can't afford to heat their homes has doubled since 2019. So will the Prime Minister support our campaign for more urgent action to invest in insulation and renewables so we can help pensioners and all families make it cheaper to heat their homes every winter?
Yes, of course. And I remind him that there are 800,000 pensioners who are not claiming pension credit, which of course then deals with the winter payment allowance. And so that's why we are taking so much care to ensure that we can get them onto pension credit. Again, aligning housing benefit with pension credit, something they left undone for years, will make a massive difference. And of course the triple lock, which over 5 years will mean pensions are expected to rise by up to £1,000.
Yasmin Qureshi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 4 years ago, the previous government ordered a review into the hormone pregnancy test drug Primados and found that the drug had caused avoidable harm. Primados was given to women in the 1960s and the 70s and resulted in many babies being born with severe disabilities. For the last 12 years, I have stood in this Parliament and pleaded with the last
I always
government
like to involve you in my
pontification. To do the right thing. So I asked the Prime Minister today, will he...
We wouldn't normally take the SNP questions because they're no longer the third biggest party in Westminster. That honour is now held by Ed Davey, who you just heard asking questions for the Liberal Democrats. But I feel, for my Scottish listeners, of my listeners in Scotland, both of those constituencies, that we probably should hang on for Stephen Flynn's questions, which means we'll spend a little longer every week covering PMQs. What do you think, Natasha Clark, LBC's political editor?
I think we should stay for the SNP.
Do you really?
Yeah.
Yeah, so do I. So we will. Back to the House.
Mr. Speaker, at the moment the Health Department is reviewing a publication from Professor Danielson, and we'll follow the results of that review. And I'm happy to ensure that the Health Minister does meet her to discuss this further.
Gavin Robinson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for visiting Northern Ireland within the last fortnight, and particularly for the time he spent with injured officers of the Police Service of Northern Ireland. He will know of their courage, but he will also know of the dogged determination of our Chief Constable, John Boucher, in his desire to see adequate resourcing for his officers who not only stand for law and order in Northern Ireland, but stand in the face of racism, of violence, and of an ongoing national security threat from dissident Republicans. So can I therefore ask him to earnestly and urgently engage in a discussion about uplifting the national security grant afforded to the Police Service of Northern Ireland and ensure that the PSNI can face the challenges that we need them to face head on?
Well, I thank him for that question, and it was important for me to go to Belfast to meet the injured officers and to say simply thank you for what they are doing, and of course the impact it has on their families. I do recognise the difficult financial position the PSNI faces, and the Chief Constable and I have spoken about this on more than one occasion, as you would expect. I mean, predominantly it's for the Justice Minister and the Executive to set the PSNI's budget, and an operational matter for the Chief Constable in relation to how he allocates that. But I have been talking to him about what further support might be possible, because I do realise just how important it is to him and to the PSNI and to Northern Ireland more generally.
Emma Foodie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Last week, ticket-selling websites like Ticketmaster left millions.
I'm confused now. Maybe there aren't any questions from the SNP. If there are, they're going to be too late in proceedings for us to stay here. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to enjoy the banter between Natasha Clark and I about what has gone on previously. But consider this to be a work in progress, or this decision at least to be pending. We'll take a quick break and then we'll pick over that when we get back. 25 after 12. I'm not sure the SNP will get regular questions, actually, at PMQs anymore, but all of this will settle down as the familiarity returns. And Lindsay Hoyle called Rishi Sunak Prime Minister, I think, at one point, so it's not just us that are struggling struggling to adjust to the new order.
I think we give them a couple of chances to redeem themselves with interesting, informative questions. If they don't, that's it. Sorry, SNP, you're gone.
Fair enough. 2 lines, really. For the winter fuel payments for pensioners, where Starmer is quite vulnerable, and then the arms licences for Israel, 30 out of 350 being suspended, where the lawyer kicked in and Sunak was less successful.
Yeah, I think we're going to be hearing 4 main arguments, I think, from Rishi Sunak and the Conservatives' opposition strategy in the next sort of 3 to 4 weeks anyway, until the leadership contest is over. Unions and pay deals, which is exactly what Rishi Sunak went on. Accusations of cronyism, which he didn't. I imagine that will crop up at some point in the next few weeks for Prime Minister's questions.
It might be tricky for him to throw that. I noticed that the woman who is going to potentially investigate allegations of cronyism by Keir Starmer was a former chair of Vote Leave, appointed to that role by a former chair of Vote Leave.
Well, that might be so. He is probably still going to go on it, I reckon.
See.
3, winter fuel, which obviously, of course, that's going to be, I think, Keir Starmer's biggest weakness in the run-up to the budget, and the Conservatives have sensed a little bit of weakness there and are going to poke that bruise as much as possible. And then 4th, Israel, which touched on as well. Like you say, I think Keir Starmer obviously had a response to that, completely ready to go, put on his lawyer hat and was absolutely ready for that question and had a very detailed answer to give. But I think rightly this has divided politicians on both sides of the House. Many Conservative politicians are worried about what the implications will be for Israel. I think, to be fair to the Rishi Sunak, he was quite notedly muted in his
it's also reported today, of course,
that.
that David Cameron would have received very similar legal advice and ignored it or sat on it, and so elected not to conduct UK government according to the rules of international law. And something Starmer didn't point out, as I understand it, if Israel were to prove its commitment to getting aid freely into Gaza and its commitment to treating detainees in conjunction with international law, these licences could be reissued tomorrow.
Yes, David Lammy did allude to that in the Commons earlier this week when he made that statement that he hoped that normal diplomatic service could at some point resume, that potentially he could change his mind on issuing these licences again. But equally, he is already facing increasing pressure, especially from Labour backbenchers, to go even further and to revoke even more of these licences, saying absolutely this is not enough. It's not going to have a material impact on Israel going forward in terms of the war effort.
At which point it becomes policy rather than law. I can't see that happening.
I don't think so.
As I mentioned earlier, when Starmer is discussing the law, he's an almost different politician from when he is discussing everything else. He's got supreme confidence on the law. A lot of people think of that moment when Boris Johnson was claiming that there hadn't been any parties or he hadn't lied about it, and Starmer just went, we'll just leave that there. And it's a different mode almost for video game fans.
Yeah, I think so. And I think you heard that slight switch in tone from Keir Starmer when he started talking about that. And he's talking about how it's not policy, it's a legal decision. It is something that the government of the day don't have a lot of control over exactly what that policy looks like. But it is a legal decision. It is a black or white. It is that there is a clear risk they could be being used in Gaza in some form of breach of international law. And that is not a risk that governments can take. And of course, he can also use the argument, this is a government that stands by the law, which is something that the Conservatives arguably couldn't do in the last, and especially the years of Boris Johnson at least.
And then Ed Davey coming in with what you might describe as trademark interest and concern for unpaid carers, with a powerful question, knitting it to the winter fuel payment. I presume Ed Davey's not going to inherit Stephen Flynn's mantle of going after the Labour Party quite as enthusiastically as he went after the Tory party?
Potentially, yes, but equally, the Liberal Democrats did successfully quite well in getting onto some of Labour's turf in the last election. Obviously, they did incredibly well, and Keir Starmer needs to be not just looking to the risk from parties like Reform, but to the risk from parties like the Liberal Democrats. They are far more of the opposition than the SNP are now at all. So yes, going on caring and winter fuel, I think that was a good one for him to start off with. And like I say, I do think it's a weakness for Keir Starmer, this winter fuel issue.
It's not going away.
Don't think it's going to go away. I think people will be asking questions about this day in, day out of government until the budget.
The plan now is to take the news headlines with Amelia Cox and then return for Keir Starmer's statement, more detailed statement regarding the Grenfell Tower inquiry, although obviously it may involve a premature curtailment of Amelia, who joins us now. It is 12:32. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I have some callers who have been very patient and were waiting to talk to me before Sir Martin Moore-Bick's inquiry. I haven't obviously issued an invitation to you to call me with your responses to what we've learnt since 11 o'clock this morning. I know that Sheila will be dedicating her entire programme to this urgent issue, and she'll be with us at 1 o'clock. Our schedule tells us that Sir Keir Starmer will deliver his statement imminently in the House of Commons, and we will cross live when we think that he is doing that. But as you may have detected so far today, we're in the lap of the gods a bit as well. Nothing is tightly timetabled. We don't know in advance how long statements are going to be. We weren't even entirely clear about the order in which questions would be asked during PMQs, although that may be slightly more down to us than down to events. But I will have a quick word with Christopher, with the warning that we may cut him off in his prime if Keir Starmer begins his statement, because I know that you wanted to talk more broadly about the housing sector and what the imminent, well, when you rang in, they were imminent discoveries. They are now established discoveries. Tell us about the bigger picture, Christopher.
Yeah, thank you, James. First-time caller. I've worked in housing for 25 years. Thank you. In social housing sector as well as in the private sector, so I can sort of bat and keep wicket and bowl at the same time, really. And one of the things that stood out to me really was the neglect of social housing. That just rings so true throughout this. It's almost a contempt. I didn't think there was indifference. It's contemptuous towards social housing. And that's been going on for about 40 years. It's really portrayed as being loser housing, and nothing in this report, the summary, surprised me. I sat and watched it, and my bosses know that I am, because I'm still involved in social housing. I work as a leasehold officer, which is extremely pertinent now, because obviously the issues around remediation works, service charges, and just the sea change that has taken place, which is much needed, although I think that had this not touched the tentacles of leaseholders, who tend to be voters, that some of the issues wouldn't necessarily get the prominence that they deserve.
How much of this do you think is attributable to right to buy? I've not heard it put so starkly often, the idea that they're seen as social housing is seen as loser housing. It didn't used to be like that. But if
that's correct,
once Margaret Thatcher had offered people at least the notional opportunity to buy their home, whether it was within their reach or not, did that contribute to what you've just described, do you think?
I think it definitely does, yes. I mean, my father was from the West Indies. He worked for London Transport. My mum was a nurse who came over from South Africa, that Windrush immigration story from the 60s. Yes. And they were in the private sector to begin with. So to get a council housing, you were doing very well for yourself. If you had a housing association one, you were doing even better. You did not want to be in the private sector in the 1960s with the echoes of Rachmanism.
Gosh.
You just there as well.
Oh, what a fascinating dichotomy. I mean, because you'd be better looked after. Of course you would.
100%, yes. And both the Conservative governments and the Labour governments of the 50s and 60s were almost in a race to see who could build the most amount of council housing.
They built 1.4, but when Churchill got back in 1950 or 51, they built something like 1.4 million council houses during that period of government.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. There was that real commitment, that part of that post-war consensus, and that's very much been broken down. And as I sat and listened to the report, and he read out the names of 72, I burst into tears because I was
powerful, wasn't it?
very, very angry. And obviously, I've read Peter Rapps's book, which how we, Show Me the Bodies, which everybody should read, because it speaks much broadly to me about how those parts of the government are supposed to protect us, and they utterly failed here. And the contempt of the Kensington Chelsea borough towards the residents, it really was. Perhaps
that's the thing that you'd have been less surprised by than the rest of us, because what you've just described as contempt was coming from the TMO. It was coming from the people that were supposed to be looking after them. So you can speak of a broader social snobbery. That's where the phrase "loser housing" would kick in. But you wouldn't expect it to be displayed by the de facto landlords, would you?
That said, though, I've worked in environments where that has been the case.
Yeah,
and
clearly.
I like to pride myself on being one of the few people who entered middle management who actually had a background in council housing. And I think that's part of the problem. I'm not suggesting that every issue and that every workplace should be populated with people who are basically the clients, but I think it gives you a really good insight to have those people in there as well, sometimes as a reality check, and hopefully not getting consumed by a toxic culture. And the culture there was toxic towards those people.
There's a lot to hold on to here, Christopher. Thank you. And that book that you mentioned by Peter Apps is absolutely essential reading, particularly if you have felt your interest in the Grenfell Tower tragedy be revivified today, be reinvigorated, or you're of an age where you weren't fully aware of its profundity and impact previously. Show Me the Bodies, How We Let Grenfell Happen by Peter Apps, APPS. A few of you asking me to repeat Christopher's recommendation there because you missed some of it. And Peter, of course, has been on the programme a number of times to discuss these and attendant issues. It really is a seminal text. 12:38 is the time. The House of Commons is sort of reconfiguring at the moment at the end of PMQ, so we will return there when Sir Keir Starmer begins his more detailed statement on the question of the Grenfell Tower Inquiry and the Phase 2 report that has been published today. I don't know what guests Sheila has got lined up for you, but we will, at the moment, we're certainly planning to speak to a couple of the... Oh, no, off to the House of Commons we go.
Mr. Speaker, this morning, Sir Martin Moore-Bick published the final report of the Grenfell Tower Inquiry. And I'm sure the whole House will join me in thanking him, the members of the inquiry and the whole team for their dedicated work. Mr. Speaker, I want to speak directly to the bereaved families, the survivors, and those in the immediate Grenfell community, some of whom are with us in the gallery today. Sir Martin concluded this morning, and I'm afraid there's no way of repeating this that won't be painful. He said the simple truth is that the deaths that occurred were all avoidable, and that those who lived in the tower were badly failed over a number of years and in a number of different ways by, as the report lays out in full, just about every institution responsible for ensuring their safety. Mr. Speaker, in the face of an injustice so painful, so deserving of anger, words can begin to lose their meaning. 7 years still waiting for the justice that you deserve. I want to say very clearly on behalf of the country, you've been let down so badly before, during and in the aftermath of this tragedy. And while Sir Martin sets out a catalogue of appalling industry failures for which there must now be full accountability, he also finds, and I quote, decades of failure by central government. He concludes that in the years between the fire at Knowsley Heights in 1991 and the fire at Grenfell Tower in 2017, there were many opportunities for the government to identify the risks posed by the use of combustible cladding panels and insulation. And he concludes, and I quote, by 2016, the department was well aware of those risks but failed to act on what they knew. He further finds that the department itself was poorly run, and the government's deregulatory agenda dominated the department's thinking to such an extent that even matters affecting the safety of life were ignored, delayed, or disregarded. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to start with an apology on behalf of the British state to each and every one of you, and indeed to all of the families affected by this tragedy. It should never have happened. The country failed to discharge its most fundamental duty, to protect you and your loved ones, the people that we are here to serve, and I am deeply sorry. I also want to express my admiration for the strength it must have taken to relive these events when giving your evidence to the inquiry, and indeed to see written down today the circumstances that led to the death of your loved ones. After all you've been through, you may feel you're always one step away from another betrayal. I get that, and I know I cannot change that with just words today. But what I can say is I listened carefully to one of the members of the inquiry, Ali Akbar, this morning, who said this: what is needed is for those with responsibility for building safety to reflect and to treat Grenfell as a touchstone in all that they do in the future. Mr. Speaker, I consider myself someone responsible for building safety, and that is exactly what I will do and what I'll demand of this government. Mr. Speaker, today is a long-awaited day of truth, but it must now lead to a day of justice. Yes. Justice for the victims and the families of Grenfell. Absolutely. But also a moment to reflect on the state of social justice in our country, and a chance for this government of service to turn the page. Because this tragedy poses fundamental questions about the kind of country we are. A country where the voices of working class people and those of colour have been repeatedly ignored and dismissed. A country where tenants of a social housing block in one of the richest parts of the land are treated like second-class citizens, shamefully dismissed, in the words of one survivor, as people with needs and problems, not respected as citizens, as people who contribute to Britain, who are part of Britain, who belong in Britain. And Mr. Speaker, unbelievably, this continued even after the tragedy. Sir Martin highlights, and I quote, certain aspects of the response demonstrated a marked lack of respect for human decency and dignity, and left many of those immediately affected feeling abandoned by authority and utterly helpless. Mr. Speaker, that alone should make anyone who feels any affinity towards justice bristle with anger. But Sir Martin continues. He finds, and these are his words, Mr. Speaker, systematic dishonesty on the part of those who made and sold the rain screen cladding panels and insulation products. And he goes on to say, they engaged in deliberate and sustained strategies to manipulate the testing process, misrepresent test data, and mislead the market. Sir Martin also cites a complete failure on the part of the local authority building control over a number of years to take basic steps to ensure that the certificates it issued were technically accurate. He finds that the work of the building research establishment was marred by unprofessional conduct, inadequate practices, a lack of effective oversight, poor reporting, and a lack of scientific rigour, and that the tenant management organisation must bear a share of the blame. Its only fire safety assessor, these are his words, had misrepresented his experience and qualifications, some of which he invented, and was ill-informed to carry out fire risk assessments on buildings of the size and complexity of Grenfell Tower. He also finds a chronic lack of effective management and leadership on behalf of the London Fire Brigade, with tragic consequences
on the night of the fire. Mr. Speaker, in the light of such findings, it is imperative that there is full accountability, including through the criminal justice process, and that this happens as swiftly as possible. So I can tell the House today that this government will write to all companies found by the inquiry to be part of these horrific failings as the first step to stopping them being awarded government contracts. And we will, of course, support the Metropolitan Police and the prosecutors as they complete their investigations. But, Mr. Speaker, it is vital that as we respond to this report today, we do not do or say anything that could compromise any future prosecution. Because the greatest injustice of all would be for the victims and all those affected not to get the justice that they deserve. Mr. Speaker, there must also be more radical action to stop something like this from ever happening again. Because one of the most extraordinary qualities of the Grenfell community is their determination to look forward. They are not only fighting for justice for themselves, they are fighting to ensure that no other community suffers as they have done. Mr. Speaker, some important reforms have taken place in the last 7 years, reforms that we supported in opposition, including banning combustible cladding, new oversight of building control, a new safety regime for all residential buildings over 18 metres, new legal requirements on social landlords, making sure fire and rescue services are trained and equipped to handle large-scale incidents, including moving from stay put to get out when needed. And we're now addressing the recommendation from St Martin's first report to introduce a new residential personal emergency evacuation plan policy for anyone whose ability to evacuate could be compromised, and funding from this from renting in social housing. Mr. Speaker, we will look at all 58 of St Martin's recommendations in detail. There will be a debate on the floor of this House. We will respond in full to the inquirer's recommendations within 6 months, and we will update Parliament annually on our progress against every commitment that we make. But there are some things I can say right now. There are still buildings today with unsafe cladding. And the speed at which this is being addressed is far, far too slow. We only have to look at the fire in Dagenham last week, a building that was still in the process of having its cladding removed. So this must be a moment of change. We will take the necessary steps to speed this up. We will be willing to force freeholders to assess their buildings and enter remediation schemes within set timetables, with a legal requirement to force action if that is what it takes. And we will set out further steps on remediation this autumn. We will also reform the construction products industry that make this fatal cladding so homes are made of safe materials. And those who compromise that safety will face the consequences. We will ensure that tenants and their leaseholders can never again be ignored, and that social landlords are held to account for the decency and safety of their homes. And as this government tackles the most acute housing crisis in living memory, building 1.5 million new homes across the country, we will ensure those homes are safe, secure, and built to the highest standards. Places of security, health and well-being that serve the needs of residents and their wider communities. Because a safe and decent home is a human right and a basic expectation. And the provision of that right should never be undermined by the reckless pursuit of greed. One of the tragedies of Grenfell is that this is a community that nurtured so much of what we want from housing. People who had made the tower their home and were entitled to a place of safety and security, not a death trap. And yet, time and again, they were ignored. Mr. Speaker, 2 weeks ago, I made a private visit to Grenfell Tower and laid a wreath at the memorial wall, and affirmed this government's commitment to the work of the Memorial Commission, delivering a permanent memorial on the site through a process led by the Grenfell community. As I walked down that narrow staircase from the 23rd floor and looked at walls burned by 1,000-degree heat, I got just a sense
of how utterly, utterly terrifying it must have been. And as I saw examples of the cladding on the outside of the building, and listened to descriptions of the catastrophic and completely avoidable failures of that fatal refurbishment, I felt just a sense of the anger that now rises through that building. And it left me, Mr. Speaker, with the profound and very personal determination to make the legacy of Grenfell Tower one of the defining changes to our country that I want to make as Prime Minister. To the families, the survivors, and the immediate community, we will support you now and always, especially those that were children. In the memory of your loved ones, we will deliver a generational shift in the safety and quality of housing for everyone in this country. And in the memory of Grenfell, we will change our country, not just a change in policy and regulation, although that must of course take place, but a profound shift in culture and behaviour. A rebalancing of power that gives voice and respect to every citizen, whoever they are and wherever they live. And Mr. Speaker, we will bring the full power of government to bear on this task, because that is the responsibility of service and the duty we owe to the memory of every one of the 72. And in that spirit, I commend the statement to the House.
Thank you, Prime Minister. 12:52 is the time. Karim Mashili is the nephew of Hesham Rahman. That's, of course, one of the names that you heard Sir Martin Moore-Bick read out earlier, because Hesham died in the Grenfell Tower fire, and Karim has been listening to that speech just as we have, and he joins me on the line now. Karim, let's start with Starmer, if we may. What did you make of that?
Hi, James. Interesting. I must say, I was surprised with the part when he mentioned removing some of these corporations from any procurement work in the UK. I mean, personally, I feel like, we had enough to go on to sort of do that anyway. But look, it's happened now.
He's a lawyer, Karim. Don't forget, he's a lawyer.
Yeah, he is. Yeah, you're right. He is. I have to remind myself that most of these politicians are lawyers and bankers. But yeah, I mean, look, it's a really heavy day today, James.
Yes.
And we're all still sort of like, taking in what we've just learned and what we've heard, and just thinking about moving forward. But I think the thing that just hurts the most, and is the sort of hardest thing to swallow, is 18 children and 54 adults' lives that was taken away for the most horrific way, and for the world to watch, were preventable. They could have been saved. This could have been avoided. How did we let ourselves get to this point where not just a corporation or a department of government, no, across the whole board, we were failed, but not because of just incompetence, but because of greed, negligence, systematic manipulation and dishonesty throughout, and yet and not only up until Grenfell, but has continued afterwards, and this is what hurts the most. But I guess I welcome Keir Starmer's words, and let's see what happens.
Well, let's see if the actions match the words. Although, as you rightly identified, exactly, that notion that all companies implicated in the report will be barred from receiving government contracts, and an unequivocal apology on behalf of the British state to the victims of the Grenfell tragedy. But as you point out, it all speaks to the thoroughness of Sir Martin Moore-Bick's report. I was reminded earlier of the scepticism and the pessimism of many people in the Grenfell community about what this inquiry would yield. Is it fair to say, Karim, that Sir Martin Moore-Bick has honoured your uncle's memory?
Yeah, I think so. I believe so. And look, James, you're right. We had our issues. We'd never been in this situation before. We didn't understand fully what a public inquiry meant, and not all of us agreed of. It wasn't our say what the Prime Minister was going to do in the early days after Grenfell. So, and how it was set up, and there was all sorts of issues. But look, it got to a point where we sat back and we watched and listened, and the inquiry was uncovering some really damning stuff, and we thought it's just best to just let them crack on. And I think they have done a good job. I haven't read the report fully, James. I mean, it's 1,700 pages. It's a lot to go through. But I've been involved. I've been at the inquiry. I've been listening, and I think that they've done a very good job at uncovering how, the why, the when, the who, and now we know. Now we have in black and white. And understand fully where the issues were, who should be held accountable for the deaths of our 18 kids and 54 adults. And it's not just about acknowledging that, it's about what we do with that information. And yes, I am a strong believer in not only just removing these corporations from any sort of public procurements, but I'll give you an example. So St. Gobain is part of the APPG, the All Parliamentary Party Group, advising them on safer and greener homes. Like, we should not be taking advice from these corporations for anything, and this isn't something that they're just doing in this country, they're doing across the world. And also, what is the government going to do about, now we know, since 1991, you guys knew the dangers of cladding fires, but yet never once seized an opportunity to try to do anything from it. Fires happened, people died, recommendations were made through public inquiries, and we still did nothing. So, look, we now know. Nothing has really surprised us, James. We already knew this, but I'm glad we have it in black and white in the way we do. We will spend the next few weeks, I guess, digesting the report. I strongly believe that we shouldn't have to wait for another 2 or 3 years to get criminal prosecutions.
Yeah.
Surely the police have enough now.
Well, the Met statement, in fact, you remind me, I haven't shared this yet. The Met statement makes clear that they cannot rely upon the findings of the inquiry as evidence. It wouldn't meet the evidential threshold. So they begin their inquiries now, but they suggest 12 to 18 months before before arrests can be realistically expected. But we will keep an eye on proceedings, and Karim, and we will keep in touch with you as well. But for now, we're out of time, and I'm very grateful to you for squeezing us in on what must be such a harrowing day. But I'm glad, if that's the right word to use, that you feel that the report has gone to the places that many of us feared it may not, given the precedent of Hillsborough and the post office scandal and the infected blood scandal and, of course, others. That was Karim Musili, whose uncle Hesham Rahman died in the Grenfell Tower fire. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you'll also find all of LBC's shows to catch up on, as well as all of Global's live radio stations. So do download Global Player for free from your app store, or head to globalplayer.com. Tom Swarbrick will be with you at 4 on LBC, but now it's Sheila Fogarty.
James O'Brien on LBC.